Today we're talking about Jeff McMahon's article on why gun control is not enough. Um, Now, before we jump into this article, let me just refer you to this link, which has a lot of data about gun deaths in the United States. In all applied ethics, but especially in this topic and also with the drug usage topic, people throw out a lot of statistics about how things actually work. What do people actually do with guns, and how many people die, and so forth. And as a philosopher, I'm not in a position to evaluate those, so I have to rely on other people's research. And so I encourage you to do your own research. Remember, figures don't lie, but liars figure. Most people who cite statistics have some kind of axe to grind. As far as somebody sent me this link last year, and it looked legit to me. It looked like a serious research place. But if you want to tell me it's biased, I'll probably believe you. In any case, check that out. Our article is by Jeff McMahan, who is a super smart, super important philosopher at a university you may have heard of called Oxford. He's actually from Columbia, South Carolina. I got to meet him some years ago, and he's a super nice guy, in addition to being very smart. Here's McMahon's conclusion that he's going to argue for. He's going to argue that the United States should ban private gun ownership entirely, or at least almost entirely. He's willing to concede that you could have guns that could be rented at shooting ranges. So you can go shoot at a range, leave it there. And maybe he might give you single-chambered shotguns for hunting purposes that could be privately owned. But other than that, definitely no guns anywhere. So gun control is not enough. We need a gun ban. Now, the way this article goes is he presents and then refutes 5 different arguments in favor of private gun ownership. So he's anticipating what his opponents are going to say and trying to shoot down, as it were, their arguments one by one. So these are what the 5 arguments are going to be. Let's take the first one, crime deterrence. Here's how this argument goes. The idea is that widespread gun ownership makes us all safer by deterring crime. After all, if criminals knew that everybody, or 50% of the population, was carrying a gun, would you try to break into somebody's house if you thought you got a 50-50 chance that the homeowner is locked and loaded? Would you try to mug somebody if you thought 50% of these people are carrying a Glock in their purse? So the idea is that the gun ownership would make us all safer. But McMahon says this is totally bogus. This kind of thought is ridiculous. If widespread gun ownership, he says, deterred crime, then the United States would have lower crime rates than other developed countries, because we definitely have the most private gun ownership. We've got tons of guns. But the United States does not have lower crime rates than other developed countries. Actually, it seems like we have the highest crime rates. Therefore, widespread gun ownership does not deter crime. In fact, he says, what's the explanation for the fact that U.S. homicide and violent crime rates are so high relative to other developed countries? He says the best explanation for that is clearly that these crime rates are caused by our gun laws, our gun customs, and our gun practices. They're not deterred. They're causing violent crime and so forth. And he develops this thought further. He says when gun ownership is widespread, criminals aren't deterred. Instead, they become better armed. They arm up so they can be better armed than their victims, and they become readier to use their weapons. So in that kind of scenario, the big losers are the people who don't own guns at all. Gun owners in that scenario are definitely safer than non-owners, right? They've got extra defense. But the big losers, the people who don't own guns at all, because the criminals that they would be vulnerable to are even more armed than they would have been otherwise. In fact, when more citizens get guns, more ordinary conflicts become deadly. Think domestic violence or so forth. If somebody can grab a gun, all of a sudden things can get fatal. More gun accidents happen. more lunatics and criminals can shoot people just on impulse. And then the police become less effective because the criminals are more armed up. Now, in fact, McMahan says, and this is really an important argument for him, private gun ownership leads to an arms race among the citizens. So here's three possible outcomes, three possible scenarios that you can pick between. You got to think, which of these do I want the most? In one scenario, most citizens are armed, but the police have to be expanded. And by expanded, I mean the police have to become better armed and more numerous and readier to fire. Now, why did the police have to be expanded? Well, because McMahan says when most citizens are armed, the criminals are going to arm up. And if the criminals arm up, the police are going to have to expand in this way in order to match them. Well, the downsides of this first scenario are clear. First of all, it's costly for the police to be expanded in this way. And again, the unarmed citizens, even if they're in a minority, they're the most vulnerable, right? Because now they got to cope with much more serious criminals. Well, here's another scenario. Maybe you got a situation where most citizens are armed, but the police are not expanded. We just don't do it. Well, in that case, you saved money from expanding the police, but now the criminals have an edge over the police because the criminals are weaponized in order to match the citizens or to be above the citizens. And now the unarmed are very bad off because they've got this like weaponized criminal force out there, but they're not protected either by themselves or by this expanded police. They've got wussy police out there who can't protect them from the criminals. Well, that's not an attractive scenario. Third scenario is this. Most citizens are unarmed, and therefore the police don't have to be expanded because the criminals aren't extra weaponized. Well, McMahan thinks that's obviously the win. That's the best case scenario out of all those. So let's do that. That's his idea. There's a lot here to think about. Do you buy McMahan's account, his sociological account of what happens when citizens arm themselves? Do you think that legal private gun ownership really leads to this arm race that he describes? Will criminals inevitably arm up more? And then will the police have to militarize, or do they have to militarize? Have they had to militarize to keep pace with the criminals? Is that really how it works? I'll leave that for you to think about. All right, now McMahan turns to the second argument that we hear in favor of private gun ownership. And that is private gun ownership allows Americans to resist tyrannical government if necessary. So this argument kind of harkens back to our revolutionary heritage, the Minutemen who have, their muskets above the door. And the idea here is that, yeah, we need those arms so that if the feds ever get out of control, we can do that again. We can have another revolution. All us Minutemen will have our weapons there, and we can resist. So McMahan thinks that this is preposterous. For one thing, he thinks the U.S. government is never going to become that oppressive. For another thing, he thinks that even if it did, privately owned firearms are not an effective means of resisting a modern army. Now look, think about this. You and all your Don't Tread on Me friends can get together with your Glocks and your shotguns and maybe even your AR-15s, right? You find all the buddies you can, and we'll line you up against the 82nd Airborne, and we'll see who wins. You got no chance. So this whole Minuteman scenario is absurd. If this ever were to become an issue, which it's not going to be, you wouldn't be able to fight them off even with your bump stock AR-15s. One tank will take you all out, says McMahan. Really, the most effective way you have to resist tyranny is through our democratic processes and procedures. So you should, get out the vote more instead of buying more guns. Now this is there's so much here we could talk about here. One thing to think about though is that really, well, one thing I've kicked around anyway is this. Yeah, you can't take on the 82nd Airborne. Those guys are going to take you out, at least in a pitched battle. But what about like guerrilla warfare? What about like insurgencies? You know who has beat out the American Army, the best military in the world? A bunch of guys in Afghanistan, who is like the poorest country in the world. There's a lot of different ways that you can have armed resistance, and it doesn't all have to be, all of us line up on one side and the other army lines up with the other, and we both shoot at each other. There's a lot of different ways, and so the effectiveness question is I think, is a live one. I mean, you can think about other places where the U.S. military has not done well. It's exactly these kind of poor insurgencies, like, well, I don't know, maybe Vietnam, maybe these other places in the Middle East, all of our kind of wars like that. Another point is it true that the U.S. government will never become that oppressive? Ponder. All right. Argument number 3. A gun ban is impossible to achieve. You're never going to be able to get the politically to pull this off, to get people to ban guns. The votes will just never be there in the United States. Our gun traditions are too firmly rooted. But McMahan thinks, well, they're only so firmly rooted because you opponents are continue to encourage them. If you would just, instead of giving up on the cause of prohibition, if you would actually just help to advance it, then it wouldn't be impossible anymore. So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. 4th, a gun prohibition could not be enforced with anything approaching complete effectiveness. There's millions of guns in the United States. There's no way you're going to get them all back from people. So why try? McMahan says, sure, that's true. We'll never totally enforce a gun ban. But guess what? We can never totally enforce the murder prohibition. It keeps on happening. Some things are worth prohibiting, even if you can never fully succeed in the prohibition. And a gun ban, he says, is one of those things. We've got prohibitions on theft. We've got prohibitions on murder and all sorts of things. And we're going to keep them there, even if a lot of people break them every day. Why not also with guns? And he says, people often point to the prohibition era and the prohibition on alcohol and say, look, a prohibition of guns is going to be the same thing. It's going to be ridiculous. It's going to be totally ineffective and just a gratuitous violation of people's rights with no point. And a lot of people want to say, the war on drugs is also a totally ridiculous prohibition that's just totally not working, and there's drugs everywhere. And a gun ban is going to be the same way. It's going to be totally ineffective. But McMahan says a gun ban would be quite different than an alcohol and drug ban, because people want alcohol and drugs for their own sake, not like to do anything else with them. They just want to ingest them. But people only want guns for self-defense. And they need guns for self-defense because so many other people have guns. And so if no one else had guns, because they'd all been prohibited, then we wouldn't need guns for self-defense, and people's desire to have them would drop away. It's totally different here than with the alcohol and drug thing. Nobody likes guns just for themselves, for their own sake. It's only to protect themselves against all the other gun owners. Maybe. Maybe not. Argument number 5. A gun prohibition violates the individual's right of self-defense. This is by far the weightiest and philosophically the most important argument in favor of private gun ownership and against a gun prohibition. And McMahan knows it. Okay, so I want you to pay careful attention to his reply, because this is going to be one of the issues that are at stake that Humor is going to bring up in our next article. A gun prohibition violates the individual's right of self-defense. If you take my gun away, this argument says, you've taken away my ability to defend myself. But we all think we have a right to defend ourselves. So therefore, don't take my guns. Here's what Humor replies. He agrees that you have a right of self-defense. I think he would agree that the guns allow you to exercise that right more effectively. But he says the right of self-defense is a derivative right. That is, it really is just, it's founded on a deeper right, which is more fundamental, and that is the right of security against attack. Now, if I take your guns away, it's true that I have prevented you from defending yourself. But if I take everybody's guns away, I have made you secure against attack. And that is the more fundamental right. You don't need a right of self-defense if I've honored your right of security against attack. So taking your guns away honors the most fundamental right, and it doesn't violate it. So yeah, that's how that goes. I haven't violated your most fundamental right at all. Now, that's his replies to all of the arguments for private gun ownership. So I leave it for you to think about which of those are strongest, which of them work, and what your objections may or may not be.